Hi, Jack.
Hi, Josh. Um,
Um,
Josh, so for the people who don't know you, could you please introduce yourself and and where are you currently?
yes. Hi, everyone tuning in later. I'm Josh Lubin-Levy. I am currently I'm the director of the Center for the Arts at Wesleyan University, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Movement Research Performance Journal. But um, for many years before that, I was a dance dramaturg, and probably the earliest dramaturgy experiences that I had, and some of the longest, was with this wonderful artist, Jack Ferver. Jack, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody tuning in later. I'm Jack Ferver, and I am upstate New York, where I live because I'm a professor at Bard College. And in the theater and performance division, though I also teach in the graduate vocal arts program, and I have the disability accessibility curriculum initiative, and I am a choreographer and a writer and a performer. And Josh was my dramaturg for a long time and is still, I would say, if I could still call and ask you something. Um, and
I'm nodding for those who aren't watching.
yeah, yeah. And also I also think that you still are. Are you still seem to me to be a dance dramaturg? I mean, you're still working with Mariah.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it's a question about my process. So we're not here to talk about my process.
Oh,
We're here to talk
right.
about your process because we're
Right.
here on the occasion of my town having its premiere at the Skirball Center. And so I thought maybe we could actually just start with you telling us a little about this new project, My Town, and when it's happening. So folks who really are
Yes,
not
I'm
reading
not
the
sure
fine
when
print.
this is coming out. So
Cool.
it's going to be November 21st, November 22nd at NYU Skirball in 2025. And I started working on this in the summer of 2023. And it began by having a meeting with Jay Wegman, the artistic director of NYU Skirball. And Jay wanted me to do something with Wisconsin Death Trip, the book by Michael Lessie, um, which is an incredible book for those of you who haven't seen it, read it, of photos and police reports um, uh, in the early uh, 1900s. And um, it's dark and also takes place around, some of it takes place around where I grew up in South Central Wisconsin. And I started with that, and then that wasn't working. And as is the case for when you're making a performance, you get asked to uh, pitch a show, and then there's grant writing, all of that, and you have to rewrite all of that, and then the show becomes something totally else, other, or at least in my case, it does. And the artists who I really love and respect, I find that as they keep hunting for what it is they want to say, it changes, and because it grows, you go down a different path. So with this piece, I because what I thought I was going to do was research South Central Wisconsin and research where I currently live in upstate New York. And because there are scenic similarities, weirdly, such as I grew up on train tracks on the Wisconsin River facing the Wisconsin Ferry Bluffs, and I now live on train tracks on the Hudson River facing the Catskill Mountains. And there's that sense of haunting and overlap of space um, felt really I felt very curious about it and curious about how to explore it through my mediums. And what ended up happening was this story. I thought I'd do all this research, and I did research periods of time and what was going on where I was growing up and what was going on here and what were similarities. And then what ended up happening from all of this was this story came forward about a student and her teacher in 1911 here. And it's fiction, as far as I know. It's what I think of Bonnie Baybridge Cohen's expression, the pipeline, of there being this all this material that's in the pipeline that you can tap into if you stay open. And I wrote this story about them, and I thought, wow, well, here's the show. And then I read it to my friend Neil Beasley, who I've known forever. Um, and he said, well, this is not a show. You've written a novella, and this isn't. No one, you can't. No one, no one, no one wants this to come and hear this for this long. And it was long. I mean, I think by the time I got to page 20, Neil said, "Oh, so is this gonna, so this is, so it's fiction." And And it had been a while since I mean, my last show was in 2022 at Mass Mocha, and that performance, I, I, especially being out of New York City, I think that a lot had opened for me about, and that was my first performance post the lockdown. Uh, and it also didn't happen in New York City, so I wasn't under also that level of, mm, what would I call that level of dot 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 that I did for years and years and years and years and years and years in New York City. There's too many words to put to it. Intensity is, I think, the kindest word to give it. So the Mass Mocha shows Global Warming Camp and other forms of theatrical distance for the end of the world. That writing, there was so much room that I allowed myself in that writing, and inside of this, I think it went too far into nov novella. And so then I went back and I thought, okay, what gets cut here and where is it going? And so then I just kept following those breadcrumbs, and it ended up more characters revealed themselves. And uh, Neil asked me where I was inside of this work, and my partner, who also has made the video material and the new music score that underscores the entire work, also asked where I was inside of the work. And so different aspects of self came forward inside of that. And that's what ended up eventually shaping this piece. And I just talked about you recently because I was asked this question about the work and how the structure of it gets built, which is that the text starts, and then, as you said, the choreography comes in and vice grips the text, and then the text in turn vice grips the choreography. So the choreographic parts, which I started working on that summer as well in 23. I'm very fortunate. I live by Bard where there's studio space, and so I had the most amount of studio time I've ever had for any work. And I made a lot of dance that got cut, and and then some dance that stayed, and then a new section of dance that I really have no idea where it came from. I just kept cutting and cutting and cutting, and then this I cut enough until this other thing emerged that happens
It,
in the middle of the piece, and has different reasons why it's there. But I feel I've sort of tentacled out in a bunch of different ways. I don't know that I really, if I described some of the making of it. It took from the summer of 23 until February of 25 for the piece to
Hmm.
happen. And then it happened for one night at MPAC. And we had a technical residency there, which I really wanted to happen. I did not want to, I have not done a show in New York City since 2019. We did the
Wow.
performance lecture for the AIDS Oral History Project in January of 2020, just before everything shut down. But I didn't want to come to the city and be figuring out all of the technical elements of this
Hmm.
piece because there's a video that plays through the whole show that Jeremy has made that is a mix of the sculpture work that Jeremy does as well as other augmented video elements, and then the the score that underscores the whole piece. Those two things alone, with a 60 to 65-minute text block that I don't stop moving inside
Hmm.
of, I I needed to be able to run that in a theater
Hmm.
first, as well as then figuring out all the lights and where is the sound going to come from and all of those elements. I did not want to arrive in New York and be figuring that out. So I'm really grateful to Impact that that happened. So that was in February, and now here we are, where I'm gonna come into this show for 2 nights, and it's such a wild thing. Performance is so wild.
Hmm.
I couldn't. There's no way I could ever perform this show to equal the amount of times I've run it
Hmm.
alone or with Jeremy or in front of some people in a studio.
Yeah, it's nice to hear about all the tentacles of it, as you said, just because, like, yeah, I mean, you get a night, you get 2 nights or 3 nights, but that can't contain all the things. I also think your work is so often the experience of the work as it's presented to the public is so tight
Mm,
that like one could imagine that you wrote a really tight script and then kind of choreographed to the script. So to know that it's goes that there's a lot of feedback loops there, the exchange with Neil reminds me a lot of like what my work was like in the room with you, which I want to get to actually a question. I was thinking about this yesterday of like wanting to talk to you about that feedback, like the interpersonal feedback, the way you connect with how people give you notes, but how you also doing that now more as a professor as well. Like, because I think about my experience as a dramaturg, it's very informed by like um you being an artist who like in a very kind way would at times be like, that was a really cutting remark, like that
mm,
was. And kind of not being aware of it, like learning how to talk through the work because because I should say, like, I think also your works are deeply personal. They often kind of examine dimensions of trauma that one could relate to queerness in general, like that's like trying to speak to a broader audience. You've talked to me about artists being the ones who digest the undigestible in the world, So, um, but I'm really struck by um, two things that I actually was curious to hear more about. One is that it's a solo performance, My Town's
yes.
solo, and um, I was curious to hear more about what that has been like. I mean, we've worked on some solos before, but when I think about your work, I often think about there's like an intensely like you're a strong author in the work.
Mm.
You come in with like a certain idea, but then there's often a kind of webbing of that out to a group of performers, and I'm working with them. Um, and so, what's it been like to kind of work over this extended period of time on My Town, but also in some ways to do it in such isolation? Maybe I'll leave that question there and then I'll ask others.
I think the isolation was so important because what this work is so much about loneliness and so much about I also there's a couple things. One is I think first formally where this student and this teacher in 1911 arrived was that I really wanted to press out into fiction as and to rely more and more on fiction in my work. And the power that I have experienced fiction to have, and the pleasure and the terror of when fiction bleeds with the or merges or collapses with the personal, and perhaps unexpectedly. And that was something that working in isolation and alone felt really important to me because of where we are as a society and where I was finding myself as an artist thinking about society post the lockdown as well as inside of the ways in which I was encountering so many people who were talking about community and being in community and then really still expressing this sense of deep isolation, a sense of real loneliness, uh, that this mortal event had happened that then became totally non-consensual reality quickly. Like how non-consensual the reality of COVID is is wild and really isolating. That's just one event
Mhm.
that I think, especially with the practice of the course that I have disability indifference or the work that I do in terms of that the way the in disability theory that the goal would be that the toxic environment the society would find a way to become less toxic to the vulnerable individual, but that's not how it works.
Mhm.
That's clearly not what we're seeing. And maybe in smaller community efforts that can happen, but even the ask for that and the labor for that has its demand and its demand on the psyche. So that loneliness really, not that loneliness, but loneliness itself and all of the ways one can feel lonely were some of which I mentioned were really important to the work. So that also starting, and it's true, I with this piece in particular, I've made so much material and then cut so much material and rehearsed it for so long and rehearsed it alone for so long, and it felt very I was so depressed as we were going into the impact performance. I thought, why have I done this to myself? Why did I work so hard on this really intricate, and something that was also very important to me was temporal disorder because I'm looking at 1911 and now here I am in 2025, but I was in Wisconsin in the 80s and 90s, and it's sort of and feeling all of those things happen. A book
Mhm.
that I really loved and was one of the books that certainly was inspiration side of this work was Dead Time by Alyssa Marder. And so also trying to write and find which I'm really excited about, finding new ways of writing and finding new ways of making dance and new ways of moving that felt that they arrived after all of this material that I've been working
Mhm.
on for all of these years, all of these shows that I've made, and now I am myself outside of where I made all of those shows in the woods
Mhm.
and digesting all of that material for something else to come forward and formally and then also in terms of content So all of that felt so lonely, so it felt so important for it to be a solo. And it feels very different. The solo feels very different than the other solo works. And partly because I'm so many different people inside of this piece and inside of this work, and also inside of how I created this work. And this might seem obvious to you, but it felt revelatory to me, was this understanding that what I do and what I have been doing is being the shattered aspects of self from trauma
Mhm.
on the stage of the psyche. So that what the audience, this stage that is this, it's why the sets have always been very, if there has been a set, it's been very minimal, or it can disappear, or it changes, or in this particular case, it's projection, and there's a reason
Mhm.
why it is projection. And um, it's viewing the mind. That
Mhm.
the stage is the psyche, and I, or when I had performers in my work, that we are the various aspects of self that get shattered from trauma and jockey and fight for attention in the
Mhm.
psyche, and that the audience is the, it becomes the viewer, becomes the witnessing part of the mind, and therefore will have their own reflective experiences of that.
Mhm. Yeah, this like I'm like my mind's going to, can I make a riff on the mind as a muscle, to like the mind is a machine, is a rhythm, is a, I because I think one of the things that I would remark on in your work is the way that as an observer of the mind, like someone who thinks psychologically and through a variety of psychoanalytic theories, but that you're so good at tracking like the rhythm of the mind as it makes these associative links and how that become constructs a reality, and then that becomes part of the work. So as you're talking about like the relationship between fiction and reality, or the imagined and the real, or living on the train tracks with the river there in Wisconsin, but also in Hudson, and how that becomes like a portal between two spaces where you can't actually physically and be in both places at once. So you also experience dissociation when you bring the worlds together, and then how do you
Yes.
bring that to the stage, right? Like it's just so, yeah. And I it makes me think in your work too, it's so interesting because when we started working together beep number of years ago, right, like it was like so much, I think of so much of what, not just, I mean, of course, all the depth of like, not depth psychology, but the deepness of psychological thinking was in your work. But a
Mm.
lot of that relationship to the imaginary was to actually filmic instances. Like I think of the prominence
Yes,
of showgirls in so much of the work, right? Or
for
like
sure.
pop culture references. And now it's almost like you're talking about being up at Hudson, and the references becomes this body of work that you carry with you, but also kind of left behind in New York and are processing. And so all of that then gets me to the the set by Jeremy, which, as you just said, is like this constantly running film, which I think
Yes,
is the first time that you've had something like a constant moving image behind a
it is.
work,
It's the first time, yeah.
and rather than the performance being the kind of the filmic element where we're like watching you move between these points, does it change the way, like now that you actually have this film running behind you, how do you, or what are you grappling with in terms of bringing the rhythms of the mind to the stage in relationship to this world that will move on even if you fumble, or does that make sense?
It does. It does. And I would say that there's a couple of things inside of that. One is that absolutely, I think films have always been so, they, because they were my first, that was my first
Mhm.
entrance to performance. I didn't grow up uh in a metropolis where there was this, let's go to the theater
Ooh.
and all of this. So it was really films, and then the excitement of, and you and I have talked about this, the excitement of the advent of VHS, and that I'm going to rewind and watch it over and over and over and over and over again, which for those of us who find comfort in our OCD was really imperative. Oh, hi. Hi. My dog is here. She'll make a little Nomi say hi. She jumped up. She wants to say hi, but just
Speaking of showgirls.
just briefly. I know Nomi named Nomi Malone, but the the need for myself repeating something filmic, she's getting comfortable. The need for myself repeating something filmic on stage became that's not in this piece.
Mm,
It's that's something that got let go of.
hmm
And um so that's one thing. Um the what the work that Jeremy has made and that partly because Jeremy has made this film of the mind. I mean it
hmm
is not it's not its own standalone film. I function with it in a way where it at times is a container or a reflection or um, I think that in working on it with Jeremy and in that collaboration, we were also very wanted to be very intentional about when it would link with the
hmm
language and movement and when it would be its own space and place because that's also I think that's also very important to me in terms of and all of my work has always been driven by psychology. I mean that is
hmm
and that I think is part of where we also really where you and I really connected bleep number of years ago. Um
Well, you're talking about the porosity between these spaces too, right? Like there's a porousness between the filmic elements in you, and it reminds me
and
so much of that.
that and the score were
Yeah.
I wanted as well to destabilize me
hmm
in the same way that and this happened and Everything is Imaginable. That last bit of text that I have in Everything is Imaginable, and I remember you and I talking about, well, what will the movement be that goes with this text? And then it had to change because I tore my calf.
hmm
And feeling so destabilized by text that then I had this track of movement that was not illustrative. And I remember you saying just make the choreography at the same that's the same amount of time as it takes for you to say it and then just hit play at the same time in your head. And it was so destabilizing in a way that you're right. My performances, I think, many of them, especially up until, and I would say up until that show, just were so uh, watertight.
hmm
And I think that I have arrived at a place of feeling safe enough where I can allow for myself to be destabilized on stage.
hmm
So inside of this, there's textual things in terms of sentence structure that are destabilizing. The choreography is destabilizing. Um, there are things that are just so challenging. I barely know where I am. And then there's this video playing and this underscore of music happening. And all of that, as you said, that porosity or this sense of melting, the sense of, or this or sense of like splitting or ripping, all of that I really want to be in the piece because otherwise I don't know what I'm doing as in terms of live performance. That's not I don't there's sometimes that I go to live works to be entertained, solely entertained. And I do think this work is entertaining. Um, but what I'm looking for artistically is to have an experience of being able to withstand mystery,
hmm
of being able to not know, even as the maker, that I've made this thing, but there are things inside of it that I don't know where they came from, and they're not. There's so much fiction inside of this, and this is all. I mean, this has been true, and I tell my students this in my performance composition class. I say assume that when you do a show that people will think it's all from you,
Right.
but and then learn how to play with that, which has been a lot of my career has been playing between the fictive and the real. This is has so much fiction in it. The things that are true are that I grew up in South Central Wisconsin. I now do live in upstate New York. They look similar, and my parents are dead. Those are
Mhm.
the things inside of the work that are true. And then there's a whole other there's a whole other 60 minutes of show here. So I think that that as well of being curious of where did that come from, and instead of trying to totally pin it down, just following it and making
Mhm.
sure that I followed its logic. That whatever was being discovered, that I really followed its logic and stayed with its vocabulary, um, to make because poetry is not vague, or certainly not the poetry I love.
Well, I think I don't know if you would say this, but I know I could say it at least maybe on your behalf that, I think you're an artist who over many years like has also battled with a mistaken critical reception that the work is about you or that
Hmm.
it's kind of like a self-centered practice and so much of the practice is actually about um reach. I mean, it really is. I mean, there's times when you've really given voice to like trying to reach a queer audience that otherwise wouldn't be reached by this work. And I think about that. I mean, you could talk much more eloquently than I could about that, but the experience I have, just to give, you know, props to our Nomi Malones and our Selena Kyles and others, is like it's part of the drawing on these filmic moments was a recognition of how much they were communal moments for us. And
Mm.
that like you saw Selena Kyle at a certain point, I saw it, we watch it together, and then we come back together, and how that also dovetails with like back to the COVID thing. So much of our experience of that I forget the word that you use, like
The non-consensual reality.
non-consensual reality was mediated through images, and yet all these images that we're watching together, and how to kind of build a space between that. But also, it's interesting that you're bringing up some ways that maybe this work has let that pop culture reference go and created your own fiction. Um, and trusting that that will reach audiences, or trusting that that will do the work without people falling back into like, oh, Jack wrote an autobiography, right? So my
Yeah.
question then, that's what excites me about this work is this kind of new step or other step in your practice. But as you work with younger generations, as students, and they're living so much of their life online, like, yeah, what have you found meaningful in your interaction with a different generation of artists and and looking back on your path from like, um, yeah, how you related to the field of culture at large to like how you came to the space of making a work where you really feel like you can lean into mystery.
Just before the lockdown, and also when Jeremy and I left New York for the longest period of time I'd ever left New York, and when we lived at Parker's, we did the AIDS Oral History Project with the New York
Mm.
Public Library with the Performing Arts. And so being with that, being with those oral histories, and how I'd even apply our application for that was that I don't think that it should be the survivor's role to uh, explain what happened to them. And so, in particular, with my research with AIDS and what happened in the culture wars and the collapse of funding that we are still in, I really wanted to hear these people's voices. And it was so, there was no way I could have been prepared for it. Arnie Zanes was one of the ones that was just I'm I could cry about it right now. I mean, it was really getting to hear someone who I really wish I would have had. And so in this understanding that this shadow, this gap, this canyon will never ever be fixed, the recognition for myself as a, a, a bridge worker that I'm going to be someone who will never fix this. There's no way that it's there. It's there. It's not going away. There's no healing for that. But how can I do bridge work to help the younger generation? Because when I was their age and I was on a panel and asked, why is this so hard? And this man in his 50s stood up and screamed, everyone who would have helped you died of AIDS and walked out. He had that was the correct response because we weren't thinking about that. So it is my job to first of all inform them about this thing that I think continually gets not discussed, especially when we are taught in arts and education, which is the impact of AIDS and what happened inside of uh, funding structures culturally and in education at the same time. And so then thinking through that lineage and then working with a younger generation of having them look for what is missing, what do you see lacking, and then what would how do you want to find that, how do you want to bring that forward. That's really where, especially by being in crits all week long in my upper level courses, that's really where I was, and I'm so grateful to be a teacher. I love teaching as much as I love making my work, and I'm so grateful that that's true. But it's also where I was really able to hone in on, oh wow, what's so missing is mystery and humor, and not the easy sophomoric humor, which I can completely love, but the kind of humor that comes from a recognition of a deep recognition. So that that's part of the approach. Another part of the approach is letting them know historically why it is so hard. Like why they're like, why can't I, how do I get a grant before I have any work? Yet how do I do work without the grant? And how do I get shown before I have had a show? All of this. And being able to talk through what happened in terms of the NEA. And um, giving them that context and then letting them know what people in my generation are trying to do, whether that's teaching or for those that are like making new community spaces and new places to show work, as well as what's opened up, I think, outside of the coasts, um, and outside of cities, especially with what's going on with online performance. And I'm curious about if that's going to come back. There was so much of that happened in the lockdown, and I'm curious about it coming back. So those are some of the aspects um, that I think are first about giving them a context, so it doesn't just feel so baffling and baffling in such a overwhelming, I'm going to give up, lay down way. It's like, here's the historical context. This is what I'm doing from my generation, and this is what you can do from yours. And that we are going to keep building this bridge forward. And we'll keep going and keep making new work. And then inside of my own teaching practice, I just really make sure that students never feel they have to make anything that resembles my work, and that so I give them formal ways to create work and then make their own.
That's beautiful. Is there anything for audiences of my town, is there anything um, just in our last moment that you're thinking like you, I almost want to ask you like, is there something you want them to take from the work? But that feels like an unfair question.
I think something that I think is clear in the work,
Mm,
that I think is clear in the work, and also something that was really important to me in making the work, and also back to your what you when you spoke about some of the when I've been critically viewed as
mhm.
in that I was either whatever. I mean, I know what you were talking about, but I think that I used to think that some of the critical. uh, or or the more cutting criticality I got was homophobia. And then
Mhm.
I would say that, especially in the course if I also through teaching one of my courses, gender theater, it really became clear that it was femphobia.
Mhm.
I wasn't being this very specific kind of gay that was being asked for, and that my embodiment and interest in women wasn't about drag.
Mhm.
And uh, so much of this work is about misogyny and the
Mhm.
erasure of the femme and the erasure of the femme in different locations of America.
Mhm.
And I'm in the work, I would say there's many women who come forward and some men, and also some of the women are men.
Mhm. I mean, I think it's worth, and I want to be careful here, but I think it's worth saying too that like when you say it's about so much of the work is about misogyny or femphobia, like when when you talk about it being about, it really means coming at about these
Yeah.
questions in a broad spectrum way. I think that's also part of it. It's like when you talk about the work being about trauma, it's not that it's trying to stage trauma. It's
No.
talking about the shattered selves of the trauma on the stage of the psyche, meaning like also the pleasurable ways we're attached to the trauma, the ways that trauma feeds certain things, the dynamics it sets up, the pain it causes, all those things. And it's one of our, I think, one of our dramaturgical notes that somehow like just became a thing between us where there was something that you described as feeling childish. And I said it's childish because it's from childhood,
That was when we
which
were in
I,
the car in Houston. I'll never forget it.
and that you're an artist who has a feeling of childishness and then traces it back to where does this what are the roots of this feeling, and what if I were to take those roots and actually map them out with an audience? Does something we would otherwise call childish suddenly become like a whole world, right? um, and a world that lets people into their own feelings of the roots of childhood as they live in the present. And so yeah, I just wanted to flag, I guess I think that's sort of the thing that um, I've always loved about your work,
Mm,
is that it really is willing to trace those roots. And when we're willing to kind of look in those ways, it's not that, I think that was the critical thing we're dancing around, which is like it doesn't have an easy resolution. The point
no.
is to let yourself explore it and realize you won't be destroyed by it.
No, I mean, and yes, yes, then that you won't be destroyed by it. No, and how do I say, no, you won't be destroyed by it. Yes, you will be able to, and depending on the work you do, yes, you will be able to incorporate. I think you will be able to incorporate all of these aspects of self. And I mean, one of the questions that I ask my students is, at what age do you think people stop being children? At what age are people adults? And then we talk about, what does that mean to be an adult? And I would say being an adult is being responsible. Being an adult is not being cruel. Being an adult is thinking about how can you take care of those who are more vulnerable than you. And um, so we have a lot of really long childhoods that we're seeing. And so part of the work as well is about bringing, in some cases, where has trauma made that sticky, or has made a real stuck part there, and by giving that aspect of self a voice and letting it scream out and have its say, that in the reflection of it, it ameliorates the loneliness of that and helps it incorporate. And which is something that I loved so much from films. I mean,
Mhm.
what I loved about films, I think of films that for some people are incredibly upsetting, and for me, I've laughed so hard through them.
Mhm.
I'm so, I mean, my movie list is it's a pretty dark movie list, but I have laughed in all of them. I mean, I remember laughing in Melancholia. I was
Mhm.
so depressed after finishing Me, Michelle for Performa 11, and Jake Usna took me to see Melancholia, and I laughed so hard through that because I related to feeling
Mhm.
like I'm just dragging myself across this. Um, but inside of this piece, yes, what I'm talking about with misogyny and its long-standing effects is the way misogyny affects everyone and the
Mhm.
way people uh, are afraid of um, or have shunned these aspects of the femme. And I think it's also where I became very drawn to Our Town. And there's a very brief moment where Emily Webb gets to have the say back to the stage manager that I want Emily Webb to be able to have. And because I've always thought it was compelling that Emily Webb dies in childbirth and that the gay coded choral director hangs himself. And
Mhm.
so what would it be to also for this iconic American play that was also very much about looking to inhabit while indict
Mhm.
uh, what is not seen, meaning life
Mhm.
in America, and Thornton Wilder's like very long essay, not very long, but I would say pretty stabbing essay at the American public of your theater is just uh soporific entertainment. It
Mhm.
doesn't do anything, and I'm gonna do something with this play. Um, that's another. I mean, that's another play. Who knows? Maybe someday I'll make a play about Thornton Wilder and Tennessee Williams kicking up their heels.
Well, I think we should probably leave it there, but I love maybe the incitement is for folks who get to see my town before or after to consider how it is a work of incorporation.
It is, yeah. This is. I think that was also, and I guess I'd also close with where I've left off those pop culture references, films. I mean, these things that have been so that I can see back in my other work. I mean, my last piece in New York City, I did end by being Michelle Pfeiffer's Selena Kyle Catwoman, and where had that shadow through to myself. I mean, leaving all of that behind was so much for me hunting for aspects of self and that aren't mine. Some are, of course. I mean, I've written this, but I would say the ones that are ones that are shared. They're they're ones that are shared amongst us, and um, I'm looking to give them voice and have them incorporate so that my audience can also find incorporation and also find the pleasure in mystery, the pleasure in the unknown, and perhaps look to explore it more.
That's beautiful. Well, thanks, Jack.
Thank you, Josh.